So by now, most of us have heard about fasting, doing a 24-hour fast, 3-day fast, etc. And we've seen a lot of benefits, both physical and mental, from fasting. But what about beyond food fasting? What about dopamine fasting? This is a term some of us have heard before, but what exactly is it? And are there actually any benefits to dopamine fasting? And how do you do a dopamine fast? Well, you're going to learn all about it in this video. So first of all, let's start with what exactly is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and there's a very common misperception that dopamine is the neurotransmitter of pure pleasure. That essentially we get a hit of dopamine in our brains and that we just feel instant pleasure. But the thing is, dopamine is more of a neurotransmitter of wanting. It makes us motivated to seek out pleasure, and it is more about the expectation of pleasure than the actual pleasure itself. For the intent and purposes of this video, we'll talk about dopamine in the scope of pleasure, just to make things a little bit simpler. The most interesting thing about dopamine, and most people don't know this, is that it functions on a scale mechanism in the brain, meaning that essentially dopamine works in a balance. And as there is more dopamine on the balance, and it tips toward that pleasure side, we feel good, and everything is great, and it feels amazing, right? The thing is, as most of us know about how a balance works, typically a balance needs to tip back in order to level out. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. So we know that as we get a really good hit of dopamine, the scale tips this way, the balance tips. But the thing is that the balance must always level out to the opposite and equal side. This means whenever we get a good hit of dopamine, the scale tips in an equal and opposite amount to the amount of dopamine that was released. And for any of you that understand physics well, this makes a lot of sense. But for the rest of us, this seems fairly cruel and unusual. Essentially, dopamine isn't as straightforward as everyone thought. And this is the fundamental thing to understand about dopamine, is that too much pleasure leads to pain. The scientific explanation for this is that pleasure and pain are actually co-located in the brain, and they work together to balance each other out. This is actually called the opponent processing theory, and as the balance tips forward, a self-regulating mechanism kicks in to balance out the pleasure with pain. So we've all experienced that uncomfortable feeling when something pleasurable ends, whether wanting another piece of cake or not wanting a good party to end. It's natural to not want good things to end and to want to make them keep going and going for longer periods of time and to sustain that pleasurable feeling. And it feels like the solution should be to keep eating, to keep playing, to keep that good feeling going. But the issue here is that we develop something called tolerance. And the idea of tolerance is that essentially you would just need to repeatedly partake in a pleasurable activity for your body to build up a habituation to that pleasurable activity. So as you do something pleasurable, you release dopamine. But as you continue to do that activity repeatedly, you release less and less dopamine with each subsequent undertaking of that activity. And the other issue is that you would need more dopamine to essentially create that same type of pleasurable feeling that you had in the beginning. And it actually gets a lot worse. Essentially, as you increase your tolerance to an activity, you actually also increase your pain, because as we learned before, equal and opposite reaction, right? So as you sustain more and more tolerance to that activity, your brain attempts to compensate for that tolerance by increasing the pain side of the equation. So anyone that's a coffee enthusiast or a caffeine enthusiast will understand the mechanism of tolerance. You might remember at some point in your life where 1 cup of coffee was really it and you felt great off of that. But as you increased your caffeine intake, you needed more and more caffeine to reach kind of that good state, that alert state. And you probably have noticed that if you spend a few days not drinking caffeine or lowering your caffeine intake, then your tolerance goes down and you are able to achieve more alertness and more kind of euphoria from the caffeine intake if you were to consume the same amount. Let's go back to that prolonged exposure, that tolerance, and that pain side of the equation. So as we build up a tolerance, this actually really impacts our dopaminergic set point in our brains. So if we continue to kind of bombard ourselves with pleasurable activities nonstop, this really impacts that balance in the brain, and then it can actually lower the dopaminergic set point. Essentially, this means that we all have a set point in which we naturally walk around with. So you know people that are just a little bit more enthusiastic and some people that are a little bit more hesitant. So that can indicate a different dopaminergic set point. And your dopaminergic set point is important because it allows you to find joy throughout your day. And as you increase all of those dopaminergic activities, the balance will tip as a way to compensate for all that dopamine in your system. And essentially, it will lower your dopaminergic set point, in which then you would walk around in a more kind of dissatisfied state than your normal state would be. So most of us have experienced this. Maybe it's kind of that vacation letdown. You went on vacation and everything was amazing, and then you come home and everything's just like blah, right? Everything's not as vivid as it normally would have been, and you don't find as much joy in your activities. And maybe you've even experienced the opposite. Maybe you've had a very quiet week, or you've gone on a silent retreat, something like that. And then you come home and everything just feels so exciting and fun, and you're just finding a lot of joy in the everyday. It should be noted that a lot of this research was done on drug addicts and the use of drugs. But the thing is that drugs are not the only thing that release dopamine. We live in a dopaminergic economy. Our economy is based on selling fat, selling sugar, selling sex, selling winning through video games. It's all about selling a good feeling and allowing people to have those cheap hits of dopamine. The thing is that that's all well and good until you realize that this is a balance and that there are repercussions from those continuous hits of dopamine. And Dr. Anna Lembke really puts this so well by saying hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, leads to anhedonia, which is the experience of the inability to experience pleasure. And a lot of this information is based on her book, Dopamine Nation, which I highly recommend reading. I think it's just phenomenal. But let's continue. So, even though all of this information is fairly depressing that I just presented, there is good news. We can reestablish our balance by changing our behavior. And this is done by abstaining from the dopaminergic activity that you think might be impacting your mind and your health for 30 days. And so we know from research that 30 days is really that time period that's needed for our brain to neuroadapt to a new level of a dopamine set point. And it should be noted that 30 days is not a hard and fast rule, and that some people can get benefit from abstaining from one day or from a week from any activity that they are just a little bit worried that they're building a tolerance to, or just maybe an activity that they kind of wish they weren't doing all the time. Now you're thinking, well, I'm not a drug addict. How will this work for me? Like, what am I supposed to abstain from? Am I supposed to just live like a monk? Like, do I not do anything pleasurable? No, that's not the point here. The point here is to reset your dopaminergic balance so that you can have more focus, have more joy, have more meaning in your life in the everyday, and to get the things done that you want to get done in the long term, and to kind of be the person that you want to be. And so what I recommend when you're choosing what to kind of exclude and include is to think about the activities that you kind of wish that you weren't doing. Maybe those activities that you find yourself doing it and you're like, wait, how did I get here? I don't want to be doing this. Like, I was supposed to be writing a document and I'm here in the kitchen eating this donut. Or I was supposed to be filming a video and I'm like scrolling Facebook for whatever reason. And so it's all those little activities that you kind of feel like, hey, I feel like someone's controlling me when I'm doing these things, because I don't really mean to do them, and I can tell that they're not super great for my mind or my health. And we all know that junk food, social media, etc. aren't great for us, but the thing is that we didn't really know before how it impacts our dopaminergic set point, and that it can actually essentially trickle over into the rest of our day and really change our brain in that it releases too much dopamine and essentially leads to a state of anhedonia, which means that we don't enjoy the things that we normally would enjoy. So if you're wanting to experiment with this, I think it's a really great idea to try giving something up for 30 days and seeing how you feel at that 30-day mark. Even if it doesn't really impact your dopaminergic set point, you will find more enjoyment in that activity if you abstain from it for 30 days, and you will essentially rebalance your tolerance level and be able to enjoy the things that you used to enjoy probably a lot more before you became tolerant to them. So as you look at your life and you realize you have all these little small addictions, just remember you're not alone. We all have the small addictions, and we all could do a little bit better at being more mindful and deliberate in the things that we do during the day. And the good news is that through kind of dopamine fasting, we can essentially reset our set point and really reconfigure our brain to be more mindful and have a feeling of self-efficacy that we didn't have before, which is so crucial to your motivation and to your brain health. So if you find videos like this helpful, make sure to follow my channel. I release videos like this all the time. And follow me on Instagram too. It's just my name, Olesa Luraski, just like the YouTube channel. And I love receiving messages from you all, and feel free to connect, ask questions, stay in touch, and I will see you all next week for another video. Take care.